Colleville-sur-Mer, June 6, 1944. A concrete casemate on the bluff above the eastern half of a beach the Allies had codenamed Omaha. Inside a resistance nest, the Germans numbered 62. A soldier of the 352nd Infantry Division sits behind a machine gun, and from where he sits, he cannot easily miss. Below him the tide is far out, and the sand runs flat and open for nearly 300 yards before it reaches the shingle bank where a man might find cover. His gun is not pointed out to sea. It is angled sideways, along the length of the beach, so that its fire sweeps the sand from the flank, rather than firing at the boats head-on. This is not an accident of where the bunker happened to be built. It is the single most important design decision in the entire German defensive scheme, and the soldier behind the gun has been placed exactly where the engineers intended him to be. The landing craft come in at low water, and the ramps drop, and the men of the first American waves step out into a killing zone that has been measured and pre-calculated to the yard. The German gunner does not have to search for targets. He does not have to guess at range. The mortar crews behind him have already registered every strip of that sand. The artillery observers have already plotted the obstacle belt as a set of aiming references. For the better part of an hour, the defenders of Nest 62, and the nests on either side of it, inflict a slaughter so complete that the American assault along this stretch of coast very nearly fails outright. Companies land at a fraction of their strength within minutes. Officers die before they can give an order. The beach fills with the wounded and the dead, and the men who have decided that the safest thing they can do is lie still behind an obstacle and not move at all. And then, a few hours later, the same soldier behind the same gun in the same perfect position is falling back inland, his ammunition nearly gone, his strongpoint being taken apart from a direction he was never meant to be attacked from. By the end of the day, the position that had been nearly impregnable at dawn is a wrecked and abandoned scatter of concrete, its guns silent, its defenders dead or captured or fled. Nothing about the casemate itself had changed. The concrete was as thick in the afternoon as it had been in the morning. The field of fire was as lethal. The gunner was as well trained. And yet the position that could not be beaten from the front had come apart completely. 6 months of American planning had assumed this beach would be the hardest of the 5 landing sectors, and it was. Yet the men who built the German defenses had assumed something too. They had assumed that a fortress this strong, sited this cleverly, manned by troops this disciplined, would hold. It did not hold. So the question worth asking is not why the Americans suffered so terribly in the first hour, because the reasons for that are well understood and were largely a matter of the defenses working exactly as designed. The question worth asking is the opposite one. Why did a defensive system that performed almost flawlessly at dawn collapse so completely by dusk? What was it about the way the Americans fought that the German engineers had never built their fortress to survive? The answer has almost nothing to do with the preliminary bombardment, which mostly failed. It has almost nothing to do with the tanks that were supposed to lead the assault, most of which never reached the shore on the eastern half of the beach. It has nothing to do with the Americans being braver or the Germans being weaker, because on that beach in those hours, neither of those things was true. The answer has to do with a specific flaw buried inside a specific theory of defense. A theory that was correct about almost everything except the one thing that mattered most on June 6th. To understand why the Strongpoints could not hold, you first have to understand how genuinely good they were, because the strength of the German defense is the part of this story that is easiest to underestimate. The fortifications at Omaha were part of what German propaganda called the Atlantic Wall, a belt of coastal defenses that ran, in theory, from the border of Spain to the northern tip of Norway. In reality, the wall was strong only in places, and it was strongest where the Germans believed a landing was most likely. The stretch of Normandy coast that became Omaha was one of those places. It was defended not by a continuous line of trenches, but by a chain of individual strongpoints, which the German army called Widerstandsnester, meaning resistance nests. Each nest was a self-contained little fortress. It held machine guns, and usually a gun of some larger caliber, and often mortars, and it was ringed by trenches, wire, and mines. The nests were numbered in sequence along the coast, from nest 60 at the eastern end up into the 70s at the western end. The concrete itself was built to a standardized German system called the Regelbau, which meant, roughly, standard construction. Rather than improvising each bunker, German engineers worked from a catalogue of hundreds of approved designs, each with a fixed layout, fixed wall thickness, and standardized armored parts, gas-tight doors, and ventilation. A gun casemate of the heavier type had walls and a roof of reinforced concrete several feet thick, enough to shrug off all but a direct hit from the largest naval guns, and even those could not be relied upon to penetrate. Alongside the big casemates were smaller open positions, the Germans called Tobrücks, tight circular pits sunk into the ground, some of them mounting a machine gun, and some of them mounting the turret of an obsolete tank bolted over the opening. The whole nest was stitched together by trenches so that the crews could move between fighting positions without exposing themselves, and the approaches were sown with mines and strung with barbed wire. It was, in the fullest sense of the word, a fortification, not a firing line. The weapons inside those positions were a strange and revealing mixture. Some were modern German pieces, many were not. Across the Omaha sector, the defenders manned a collection of guns that had been scraped together from half the arsenals of conquered Europe, captured French and Czech and Polish artillery of assorted calibers, pressed into service, and given German designations. The machine guns ranged from the fast-firing modern German models down to water-cooled weapons that dated back to the previous World War. This is worth noticing, because it cuts against the popular image of a uniform and perfectly equipped German war machine. The strength of the Omaha defense did not come from the quality of every individual weapon. It came from how those weapons were arranged, from the geometry of their fire, from the fact that mediocre guns sighted with great cunning can be far deadlier than excellent guns sighted carelessly. What made the layout intelligent was not the individual nests but the way they were positioned relative to the ground. The beach at Omaha is backed by a steep bluff, in places 150 feet high, that a man cannot easily climb while carrying weapons and under fire. There were only 5 places along the whole crescent where a vehicle could get off the beach and inland. 5 natural valleys or cuts that the planners on both sides called draws. The Germans understood that these 5 draws were the only exits that truly mattered, because tanks and trucks and artillery could only leave the beach through them. So they concentrated their strongpoints around the mouths of the draws. Nests 71 and 72 guarded the Vierville draw at the western end. Nests 66 and 68 covered the Les Moulins draw in the center. Nests 64 and 65 sat astride the Saint Laurent draw. Nests 61 and 62 flanked the Colville draw to the east, and Nest 60, at the far eastern end, watched over the last cut in the cliffs. The exits were the prize, and the exits were where the German fire was densest. Now consider the single most important feature of the design. The heavy guns in the casemates were, for the most part, not pointed out to sea. They were sighted to fire laterally along the beach, roughly parallel to the waterline. This is a technique soldiers call enfilade fire, and it is devastating. A gun firing straight out to sea can only strike the narrow strip of targets directly in front of it. A gun firing along the beach can rake the entire length of it, so that a single well-placed weapon can sweep hundreds of yards of sand where men are wading ashore. The United States Army official history of the battle described this arrangement plainly. It noted that the heavier guns were sighted to give lateral fire along the beach, and that their traverse was deliberately limited by thick concrete wing walls which concealed the muzzle flash and made the guns very difficult to spot from the sea. Those concrete wing walls are the detail that reveals the whole philosophy. On the seaward side of each gun casemate, the Germans built a thick blank wall of reinforced concrete. That wall meant the gun could not fire straight out to sea at all, and it meant that a warship looking at the position from the water saw only a smooth face of concrete with no visible embrasure to aim at. The gun fired from the side, out of an opening the ships could not easily see, sweeping the beach from an angle. This solved 2 problems at once. It protected the gun from direct naval gunfire from ships standing offshore, and it turned each weapon into an enfilade machine that could scourge a huge stretch of the landing area. It was, on its own terms, an elegant and formidable solution. The popular image of German gunners firing out at the boats, the image most people carry from films, is close to the reverse of what the defenses were actually built to do. The obstacle belt in front of the nests was equally deliberate. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel took charge of the coastal defenses in this sector in the winter of 1943 to 1944, he drove the construction of a dense band of underwater and beach obstacles designed to wreck landing craft and to funnel survivors into the pre-planned killing zones. There were rows of heavy timber posts, many of them tipped with mines. There were steel structures the Allies called Belgian gates, great gate-like frames of steel that stood higher than a man and weighed better than a ton apiece. There were sloping log ramps meant to flip landing craft, and thousands of the steel crosses called hedgehogs, and telemines wired to the tops of stakes. Rommel wanted the enemy stopped at the waterline, tangled in the obstacles, and cut down by the flanking guns before he ever reached dry sand. Behind the beach, he laid wire and minefields to seal the flat ground below the bluffs. The whole system was a machine for killing men in the water and on the sand. The obstacle belt was tied intimately to the rhythm of the tide, and this detail matters a great deal to what followed. Rommel had positioned his obstacles to do their worst at high water, when the rising sea would hide the mined stakes and steel frames just below the surface, so that landing craft would drive onto them blind and be torn open or blown up before the ramps ever dropped. A landing at high tide would have meant craft impaling themselves on hidden obstacles far out from the sand, but the Allies chose to come in near low tide, precisely so that the obstacles would be exposed and visible, standing bare and dry on the open flat where the assault engineers could see them and, in theory, blow them up. This choice saved many landing craft from the mined obstacles. It came at a terrible price. It meant the men and the engineers had to cross a vast stretch of naked sand, 300 yards or more of it, under the full sweep of the flanking guns, before they could reach any cover at all. Rommel's obstacles were partly neutralized by the low water. The low water also turned the beach into the longest and most exposed killing ground on the whole invasion front. The tide gave with one hand and took with the other. The heaviest guns in the nearest strongpoints were serious weapons, not improvised ones. Nest 61, on the eastern side of the Colville Draw, mounted an 88mm gun in a casemate, the same feared caliber that German crews used against tanks and aircraft alike, sighted here to fire in enfilade across the sand. Nest 72, at the mouth of the Vierville Draw at the western end, mounted another gun of similar weight behind its concrete. These were the anchors of the defense, the pieces that could destroy a tank or a landing craft with a single hit, placed exactly where they could sweep the exits. Around them, the lighter guns and the massed machine guns filled in every angle, so that no stretch of the beach in front of the draws was left uncovered. The interlocking was the whole point. A man who dropped below the arc of one gun fell into the arc of another. If the forgotten engineering behind battles like this one interests you, the way a defensive scheme can be brilliant and doomed at the same time, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed history reach the people who care about getting it right. To see how well that machine worked, you only have to look at the first hour, on the flat sand in front of the draws, where the enfilade guns did their work. The American plan was a marvel of timing on paper. Swimming tanks would arrive first and engage the defenders. Then engineers would blow lanes through the obstacles. Then the infantry would land through the cleared lanes and cross the beach behind armor and covering fire. Almost none of it happened as drawn. On the eastern half of the beach, the swimming tanks of one battalion were launched too far out in seas far rougher than the machines could survive, and most of them sank on the way in, drowning many of their crews. The infantry there arrived on a beach where the obstacles were still intact, where there were almost no tanks to shield them, and where every flanking gun was still in action. The story of those swimming tanks is worth telling in full, because the contrast between the two halves of the beach shows how narrow the margins were. The Americans had a novel weapon for this landing, the duplex drive tank, an ordinary Sherman fitted with a tall canvas skirt and a pair of propellers so that it could float and swim to shore under its own power, then drop its skirt and fight as a tank the moment it touched the sand. The idea was that these tanks would swim in ahead of the infantry and shoot the defenders from the waterline. On the eastern half of Omaha, the tank battalion tasked with this launched its swimming tanks far out, several thousand yards from shore, into a sea running much rougher than the fragile canvas skirts had ever been designed to handle. The waves swamped them. One after another the tanks flooded and went down, carrying their crews with them. Of the 32 swimming tanks launched on that half of the beach, all but a handful sank before reaching the shore. The infantry there landed with almost no armor at all. On the western half, the commander of the other tank battalion looked at the same heaving sea and made the opposite decision. Rather than launch his swimming tanks into the waves, he had his landing craft carry them all the way in and set them down directly on the sand. Most of that battalion's tanks reached the beach intact. The difference was stark. Where the tanks drowned, the infantry faced the intact strongpoints naked. Where the tanks landed, they gave the infantry at least some armored fire to shoot back with. And it was on that western half that some of the earliest movement off the beach began. The lesson was not lost on anyone who studied the battle afterward. The plan had bet heavily on a clever new weapon, and where the weather broke the weapon, the plan came close to breaking with it. The result on that flat, open sand was exactly what the German engineers had designed it to be. The men of the first waves stepped off the ramps into interlocking fields of fire that swept the beach from both flanks. A soldier often could not tell where the fire was coming from, because it was not coming from directly in front of him. It was coming from the sides, from positions he could not see, angled along the sand. Company after company was pinned at the water or cut down crossing the flat. The best-known case is Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, which landed almost directly in front of the Vierville draw defences at the western end, and which was shattered within minutes of the ramps dropping. That company included a group of young men from the small town of Bedford, Virginia. Bedford lost 19 of its sons on that single day, the heaviest proportional loss suffered by any American community on the 6th of June. Across the whole beach, the survivors did what men under that kind of fire will do. They took whatever cover they could find at the shingle bank, and they stopped moving, because to move was to die. The German mechanism was working precisely as intended. The forward strongpoints were not there to win the battle by themselves. They were there to hold the enemy on the sand, to pin him in the open, while the mortars and artillery sighted farther back did much of the actual killing. The nests spotted the targets and swept the beach, and the tubes behind them dropped high explosive onto men who had obligingly stopped in the open. By the middle of the morning, the assault along significant stretches of Omaha had simply stalled. Later waves piled up behind the first ones. Vehicles could not land, because the beach was still swept by fire and the obstacle lanes were not yet cleared. On the command ships offshore, senior American officers watched the fragmentary reports come in and began, quietly, to consider the possibility that the landing here might have to be abandoned altogether. It is worth pausing on how little popular attention this German success usually receives, because the reason for that neglect is instructive. History tends to be written by the side that wins, and the Allies won the larger campaign decisively. The near disaster of the first hours at Omaha gets remembered mainly as a prelude to eventual triumph, a terrible morning that was redeemed by the afternoon. But if you freeze the battle at around 8:30 in the morning and judge it purely on its own terms, the German defensive system was winning, and winning convincingly. The men who designed those enfilade positions had built something that did precisely what they promised it would do. The failure, when it came, was not a failure of the concrete or the guns or the gunners. It was the failure of a deeper assumption, and to see that assumption clearly, you have to understand the theory of coastal defense that the whole Atlantic Wall was built to serve. That theory belonged above all to Rommel, and it grew directly out of his own experience of being on the receiving end of Allied power in North Africa. Rommel had watched what happened to an army that tried to maneuver in the open under total Allied air superiority. He had concluded that once the Allies were firmly ashore in France, with their command of the air, and their overwhelming supply of materiel, they could not be thrown back. Therefore, he argued, the invasion had to be defeated in its first hours, at the waterline, before the beachhead could be consolidated. He told his staff that the first 24 hours of the invasion would be decisive. In a phrase that would later give a famous book and film their title, he said that for the Allies, as well as for Germany, it would be the longest day. His logic followed straight from that premise. Destroy the enemy in the water. Wreck his equipment while it is still afloat. Do not merely delay him, but stop him dead on the sand. This is why the Strongpoints were built the way they were. They were a crust, a hard shell along the very edge of the sea, packed with as much firepower as possible right at the waterline, because Rommel believed the water's edge was where the battle had to be won or lost. Everything was concentrated forward. The design assumed that if the crust was strong enough, the enemy would never get through it in the first place. But not every German commander agreed with this theory, and the disagreement matters enormously to what happened at Omaha. The commander of the armored forces in the west, General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, and the overall commander in the west, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, believed in an older and more classical idea. They wanted to hold the powerful panzer divisions back from the coast as a central mobile reserve. Let the enemy land, they argued. Let him commit himself, then identify the real invasion, mass the tanks, and destroy the beachhead with a concentrated armored counterattack before it could grow. This is the doctrine of defense in depth, and it is the direct opposite of Rommel's crust at the waterline. Hitler, presented with two incompatible theories, chose the worst possible resolution. He split the difference. He gave Rommel control of a few panzer divisions near the coast, and he kept the rest back under the direct control of the High Command, releasable only on his personal authority. The result was that neither theory was actually implemented. The crust was built, but it was not backed by a mobile reserve committed wholeheartedly to Rommel's forward battle, and the central reserve that did exist could not be released in the crucial early hours of June 6th. Part of the reason was the tangle of authority Hitler had created, in which no one below him would order the main armored reserve forward, and Hitler himself was not woken and did not give the order until well into the day. It was one of several compounding failures of command, and it should not be reduced to the single image of a sleeping dictator, but the effect on the ground was the same. The German defense at Omaha was a crust with very little behind it, and this fact, more than any other, is the hidden flaw in the fortress. The men holding that crust were better than the Americans expected, and the story of how the Americans came to expect the wrong enemy is one of the quiet tragedies inside the larger one. Allied intelligence believed Omaha was defended mainly by a single second-rate static division, the sort of formation built for holding a fixed line and filled out with older men and with conscripts drawn from occupied territories, including a number of former prisoners from the Eastern Front pressed into German service. Such a formation was thin on the ground, short of transport, and thought to be low in morale and fighting quality. Planners expected the beach to be held by something on the order of a reinforced battalion of these second-line troops. Had that been true, the assault would still have been hard, but it would have faced perhaps half the men and a fraction of the skill that were actually waiting. That picture was out of date. Some months before the invasion, the German command had moved a full-strength, well-trained field division into the sector, the 352nd Infantry Division under General Dietrich Kreis. It was built around a core of veterans from the Eastern Front, stiffened with younger conscripts and trained hard in defensive fighting, and it was among the best of the infantry divisions defending any of the 5 beaches. Rommel had deliberately pushed it forward toward the coast to thicken the defense, layering its regiments over the static troops already in the bunkers, so that the men in the nests were a mix of the old garrison and the newer, tougher field division. For years after the war, a comfortable story circulated that the strong division had simply happened to be in the area on a training exercise, a matter of bad luck for the Americans. That story is misleading. The division was there because Rommel had put it there, on purpose, as part of exactly the water's edge defense his theory demanded. Allied intelligence was not blind to this. In the days just before the landing, indications of the division's forward move actually reached Allied hands. But the warning came too late, and it did not filter down to the assault regiments and the men climbing into the landing craft in time to change a single plan or brief a single company. The Americans came ashore expecting a weak enemy and met a strong one. This is part of why the first hour was so terrible. But the quality of the defenders, like the quality of the concrete, is not the reason the Strongpoints eventually fell. A better division held the crust longer and killed more attackers. It could not repair the flaw in the theory. To appreciate that flaw, it helps to think clearly about the general principle the whole German scheme depended on. A concealed weapon, sighted to fire along a fixed line, is almost unbeatable as long as the enemy stays inside its planned field of fire. The gunner does not have to be a genius, he has to be in the right place, pointed in the right direction, with enough ammunition, while the enemy obligingly moves through the zone he is covering. That is the entire logic of the Omaha defense, scaled up across a chain of nests and dozens of guns. As long as the Americans behaved the way the design assumed they would behave, staying on the beach, trying to force the draws directly, pushing straight into the teeth of the enfilade guns, the system would grind them down. The killing zone was the beach. The plan was to keep the enemy in the killing zone. And this is exactly where the flaw lived, because the entire system depended on the enemy remaining in the one place the guns could reach. The German defense had an answer for a man on the beach. It had a poor answer, and in places almost no answer at all, for a man who left the beach in a direction the guns were not built to cover. What neither side fully understood as the ramps dropped that morning was that the American way of breaking a fortified beach did not require winning the fight on the sand at all. It required getting off the sand, at the points where the crust was thin, and attacking the fortress from a direction its designers had never seriously prepared to defend. To see where that American approach came from, you have to look away from the beach and at how the United States Army had learned to think about assaulting a fortified position. The Americans did not have a secret weapon that made the difference at Omaha, nor a superior fortification doctrine of their own. What they had was a combination of tools and a habit of mind, assembled over years, that treated a strong point not as a wall to be battered down head-on, but as a problem to be broken open at its weakest seam and then unraveled from the inside. 3 things came together on that beach, and each of them attacked the German crust at a different level. The first was the raw, close-range firepower of the United States Navy. The second was the specialist engineering that could tear a hole in the obstacle belt. And the third, the decisive one, was the willingness and the initiative of small groups of infantry to leave the killing zone entirely and climb. Start with the Navy, because the Navy struck the first real blow against the crust, and it did so in a way the German designers had specifically tried to prevent. Remember that the casemates were built with their thick wing walls facing the sea, precisely so that warships could not see or hit the guns. This defense worked well against the plan the Allies had actually intended, which was a short preliminary bombardment from ships standing well offshore, followed by waves of heavy bombers. Both of those preliminary fires failed almost completely. The naval bombardment lasted only about 30 to 40 minutes, which was nowhere near long enough to destroy hardened concrete casemates, even when the ships could see them. The heavy bomber strike was worse than useless against the beach defenses. More than 1,300 heavy bombers were assigned to hit Omaha, but under heavy cloud, the crews delayed their release by a few seconds to avoid hitting the incoming landing craft, and their bombs fell far inland. By most accounts, not a single bomb is known to have struck the beach defenses or the bluffs. The infantry had been promised craters to shelter in and a stunned enemy to fight. They got neither, so the crust survived the planned bombardment largely intact, exactly as its designers had hoped. What the designers had not planned for was what the United States Navy did next. As the assault stalled and the reports from the beach grew desperate, the commander of the fire support group, Rear Admiral Carlton Bryant, aboard the battleship Texas, ordered his destroyers to do something that ran against every peacetime rule of prudent seamanship. He ordered them to close the range. His message to the destroyer captains was blunt. He told them to get on the enemy guns, that those guns were raising hell with the men on the beach, and that it could not be allowed to continue. The destroyers of the supporting squadron turned and ran straight in toward the shore, some of them closing to within 800 to 1,000 yards of the beach, so close that a few of them scraped their hulls on the bottom in the shallows. At that range, everything changed. A destroyer sitting almost on top of the beach was no longer looking at a smooth, blank wall of concrete from far out to sea. It could see the enfilade guns from the flank, could see the muzzle flashes, and could see exactly where the fire sweeping the sand was coming from, and it could put shell after shell directly into the embrasures and the gun positions. The wing walls that hid the guns from distant ships were useless against a warship firing from a few hundred yards off the beach at an angle. The destroyers fired with an intensity that alarmed the admirals watching their ammunition supply. In the space of little more than an hour, individual destroyers fired hundreds, and in some cases more than 1,000 rounds each. One knocked out a gun position by putting rounds straight through its shield. Others walked their fire along the bluff, following the fall of shot from the few American tanks that had made it ashore, hammering whatever the tanks were shooting at. A senior officer on the beach later signaled his thanks to the Navy in as many words, saying that as the troops began to move up the slope, he joined in thanking God for the fleet. The close-range naval fire did not destroy the German defense by itself, but it suppressed the strongpoints at the critical moment, forced the gunners to keep their heads down, and knocked out enough weapons to give the infantry a chance to move. It cracked the crust. The second blow against the crust came from the combat engineers, and their task was one of the most thankless of the entire day. Before any vehicles could leave the beach, someone had to blow lanes through Rommel's obstacle belt, and that someone was the specially trained Gap assault teams, a mixed force of Army engineers and Navy demolition men. Their job was to land in the very first minutes, alongside or just ahead of the leading infantry, wade into the forest of mined obstacles, while under the full weight of the enfilade fire, lay their explosive charges by hand, and blow clear lanes through which the following waves could pass. They were to open a series of numbered gaps, each wide enough for landing craft and vehicles, and they were to do it in about half an hour, before the rising tide covered the obstacles. It went catastrophically at first. The teams were scattered by the same current that scattered everyone else. Much of their equipment was lost in the surf. In several cases, the leading infantry, desperate for cover, sheltered among the very obstacles the engineers were trying to demolish, so that the demolition men could not fire their charges without killing their own comrades. German fire cut down the exposed engineers as they worked, and in more than one instance, enemy shells struck the explosive charges the teams had already laid, detonating them prematurely and killing whole clusters of men at once. Only about a third of the teams reached anything like their assigned positions, and yet, at a cost that ran above 40% of their number in casualties, the engineers succeeded in blowing 6 gaps through the belt that morning, and in marking them for the craft coming behind. The naval demolition parties attached to them suffered comparably, with something close to half of one group killed or wounded. These men, dying in the water among the steel and the mines, tore the openings through which the follow-on forces and the vehicles would eventually pour. If the destroyers cracked the crust, the engineers pried the cracks open, but firepower and engineering only created the opportunity. The blow that actually destroyed the strongpoints came from the infantry, and it came from a direction the German designers had failed to defend. This is the heart of the whole story, and it turns on the shape of the ground. The 5 draws were the obvious way off the beach, which is exactly why the Germans had packed their strongpoints around them. Every enfilade gun, every mortar, every registered artillery concentration was oriented to slaughter men who tried to force those 5 exits. As long as the Americans kept trying to push straight up the draws, they were fighting the battle the Germans had designed, and they were losing it. The stretches of bluff between the draws were a different matter entirely. Those steep slopes were not the natural exits, because a vehicle could not climb them. The Germans had therefore defended them only lightly, with a scattering of rifle pits and trenches and the occasional machine gun. And here is the crucial point about how those few weapons on the bluffs were sighted. They were placed to fire sideways, to sweep other stretches of the beach with flanking fire, exactly like everything else in the scheme. They were not placed to fight men climbing the slope directly beneath them. The United States Army official history states this with great clarity. It records that the American penetrations were made where the enemy defenses were thin and lightly held, on the long stretches of bluff between the draws. It describes those bluff defenses as lightly manned rifle pits connected by trenches, with only a few machine gun emplacements, and it notes that those machine guns were sited for flanking fire onto other parts of the beach, rather than for dealing with troops coming directly up from below. Read that again, because it is close to the entire answer to the question this story began with. The guns that made Omaha a slaughterhouse were pointed along the beach. The men who broke Omaha did not stay on the beach. They went up the bluffs, in the gaps between the Strongpoints, straight into the one approach the enfilade design could not cover, because a gun aimed sideways along the sand cannot easily fire at a man crawling up the slope directly under its position. Getting the men to make that climb, however, required leadership of a specific and personal kind, delivered on a beach where many units had lost their officers and their radios and their sense of what to do next. The stalled soldiers at the shingle were not cowards. They were doing exactly what the situation seemed to demand, which was to take cover and stay alive. Someone had to make them understand that staying on the beach was the thing that would kill them, and that the only way to survive was forward and up. Two men have come to symbolize that turning of the tide, though there were many others whose names are less remembered. On the eastern half of the beach, Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment came ashore into the chaos and is remembered for a line that cut straight to the truth of it. He told the men around him that two kinds of people were going to stay on that beach, the dead and those who were going to die, and that they had better get off it. That grim sentence, often wrongly credited to another officer in later films, was the essential message. The beach was death, movement was life. On the western half, Brigadier General Norman Cotter, the assistant commander of the 29th Division, walked the beach under fire, doing the same work in person. He organized men, found a weak point in the wire, and personally supervised the blowing of a gap with a length of explosive called a Bangalore torpedo to open a path off the sand. When he found a group of Rangers pinned at the seawall, he urged them forward with a challenge that would become the motto of the Ranger Regiment, telling them to lead the way, and then went through the gap himself at the head of the men. These men and others like them physically pried small groups of soldiers off the beach and pointed them at the bluffs. And once those small groups began to climb, in ones and twos and squads, threading up the shoulders of the draws and the slopes between the nests, the entire German scheme began to invert. Picture it now from inside Nest 62, above the Colville draw, where the machine gunner had spent the morning sweeping the sand. His gun still worked. His field of fire down onto the beach was as deadly as ever, but he was running low on ammunition because the crust had no depth and no easy resupply, and the mortars behind him were firing off the last of their registered rounds. And then, gradually, the danger stopped coming from the beach in front of him and started coming from the flank and the rear, from American infantry who had climbed the bluff between the nests and were now moving along the high ground behind the Strongpoints. The artillery observer, directing fire from that nest, was killed at his post. The neighboring position, Nest 61 with its heavier gun, was overrun. Around the middle of the day, the Strongpoint that had been nearly impregnable at dawn was being reduced by infantry attacking it from the landward side, the one side it had never been built to hold. The gunner, who could not miss a man on the beach, found that the battle had simply walked around him. Reducing one of these nests from the landward side was close and brutal work, and it followed a grim logic of its own. A concrete casemate is nearly invulnerable to a man in front of it, but it has doors, and ventilators, and firing slits, and blind spots that its own thick walls create. Small groups of American infantry, once they were up on the high ground and among the trenches behind a strongpoint, went at the positions with the tools of close assault. They breached the wire with Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes packed with explosive that could be pushed under an obstacle and detonated to blow a gap. They worked along the connecting trenches with rifle and grenade. They put satchel charges, canvas bags heavy with blocks of explosive, against doors and embrasures and over ventilation openings, so that the blast and the choking fumes went where the concrete could not protect the crew. A gun that could sweep 300 yards of open beach was helpless against a man crouched against its own back wall, below its field of fire, feeding a charge through a slit. One position at a time, the defenders were killed at their guns, or driven up out of their trenches, or left with no choice but to put up their hands. This same reversal played out along the length of the beach as the morning became afternoon. Nest 60 at the far eastern end was taken from above and from the east because its defenders, sighted to fire along the shore, had almost no view of and no weapons for an enemy coming down on them from the high ground. Nest 65 at the Saint Laurent draw had its guns silenced partly by that flanking movement and partly by direct fire from armoured vehicles that had finally worked their way off the beach. At the western end, above the Vieilleville draw, General Cota's group and the Rangers pushed up and into the village of Vieilleville from the landward side and then came down onto the draw defences from behind, and engineers blew the great anti-tank wall that blocked the exit with a heavy charge of explosive. One after another, the strongpoints that had been invulnerable from the front were unstitched from the flank and the rear. The pattern by which the beach exits opened tells the same story as the fall of the nests. The exits did not open in the order the planners had drawn, and they did not open by frontal assault. The bluffs between the draws gave way first, in the gaps, where the infantry climbed. Only after the high ground behind an exit was taken and the strong points guarding it were being reduced from the rear, could the draw itself be cleared and opened for vehicles. The natural order of the American breakthrough was upward and then inward, up the undefended slope and then down onto the defended exit from behind, rather than straight up the defended exit from the front. It was the exact reverse of the movement the German fire plan had been built to stop, and that is precisely why it worked. The deeper reason the German defense could not recover from these penetrations lay in the flaw that had been built into it from the start. The crust had no depth. Once the Americans were up on the bluff and in among the nests, there was very little behind the beach positions to stop them. There was no second line of comparable strength, and there was no timely counterattack because of the very doctrinal muddle that had crippled the German command before the first shot was fired. The mobile reserve of the 352nd Division, a battle group built around one of its grenadier regiments, was not thrown against the Omaha penetrations in the crucial hours. Early in the day it had been sent chasing a false report of paratroopers well away from the beach, then ordered to countermarch, and it spent much of the day moving back and forth under harassing Allied air attack. It was largely worn down and broken up piecemeal, and its commander was killed, without ever delivering the concentrated blow that might have driven the thin American lodgment back into the sea while it was still weak. The great panzer divisions that might have made a decisive counterattack stood idle inland, held back by the same tangle of authority, and by the time any of them were released, the chance to hit the beachhead while it was still weak had passed. So the German defenders in the nests found themselves in an impossible position by the afternoon. They had inflicted terrible losses. They had very nearly won the battle at the water's edge, just as Rommel's theory demanded. But their ammunition was finite, their strongpoints were being taken from behind, no reserve was coming to relieve them, and no counterattack was coming to restore the line. The commander of the division, General Crace, reported to his superiors that night that his coastal positions had been overwhelmed, that he could perhaps contain the Americans for one more day, but that he would need reinforcements after that. He was told the plain truth. There were no reserves left to send him. It is worth being precise about the human cost on both sides, because the numbers themselves reveal the strange shape of this battle. American casualties at Omaha on the 6th of June are genuinely uncertain, and honest historians say so. The most commonly cited figure is around 2,400 killed, wounded and missing, though estimates in the sources range lower, and in some older accounts considerably higher. Against that, the German 352nd Division lost on the order of 1,200 men across the whole day along its entire front, fighting the Americans at Omaha and the British to the east as well, a much smaller number than the losses it inflicted. In the killing zone itself, the disproportion was extreme. A relatively small number of German defenders in the beach nests, a few hundred men holding the positions in front of the American landing, inflicted the great bulk of the roughly 2,400 American casualties suffered along that beach. And yet those same defenders, for all the slaughter they caused, could not hold their ground, because they could be outflanked and could not be reinforced. That is the paradox of the whole engagement stated in arithmetic. The defense was efficient beyond almost any comparison, and it still failed, because efficiency in the killing zone was never the same thing as the ability to hold the position. One myth deserves to be set aside here, because it has grown up around exactly this disproportion. A German machine gunner from Nest 62 later claimed, in a memoir written more than 50 years after the battle, to have personally fired many thousands of rounds and caused something like 1,000 to 2,000 American casualties by himself. That claim has been widely repeated, but historians who have examined it, both American and German, regard the numbers as wildly implausible. The total American casualties along the entire beach were only about 2,400, and the idea that a single gunner accounted for most of them cannot be reconciled with the evidence. The story is worth mentioning only in order to set it aside, because the truth needs no exaggeration. The real defense was murderous enough without inflating one man's tally into legend. There is a second temptation worth resisting, which is to imagine that a better preliminary bombardment would have solved everything, and that the near disaster was simply a matter of not bombing hard enough. The reality is more sobering. No bombardment available in 1944 could reliably have destroyed those hardened casemates in the short window allotted to it, and the deeper problem was one of doctrine rather than of the weight of shells. The Allied plan leaned too heavily on a brief bombardment and on air power that missed, and it underestimated how much of the German crust would survive to be dealt with at close range and by hand. The men who eventually solved the problem did so not with a heavier bombardment, but with the close-in fire of the destroyers, the sacrificial work of the engineers, and above all the decision of the infantry to climb where the guns could not follow. Now stand back from the beach and look at what actually failed on the German side, because it was not any of the things the defenders themselves could see. The concrete did not fail, the guns did not fail, the gunners did not fail, and the division holding the crust was among the best on the coast. What failed was the theory the whole fortress had been built to serve. The theory held that a battle for a beach is won or lost at the water's edge, and that a strong enough crust of enfilade fire right at the waterline will defeat any landing before it can begin. That theory was not stupid. Against a purely frontal assault, an enemy who insisted on forcing the draws head-on and staying in the killing zone, it would very likely have worked, and for the first terrible hour it nearly did. But the theory contained an assumption it never examined, the assumption that the enemy would fight the battle on the beach, in the zone the guns covered. The Americans, in the end, declined to fight that battle. They cracked the crust with naval fire, pried it open with the engineers, and then simply left the killing zone and climbed the undefended slopes to take the fortress from behind. There is a further irony buried in this, which is that the German army was not short of any single capability the Americans possessed. German artillery doctrine was excellent. German small unit leadership and initiative were, by wide agreement, superb throughout the war. What the German defense at Omaha lacked was not a piece of equipment or a category of skill. It lacked depth, and it lacked a committed reserve, and both of those absences flowed directly from an unresolved argument at the very top about how the invasion should be met. Rommel wanted the crust at the waterline. Rundstedt and Geyer wanted the mobile reserve inland. Hitler gave them a contradictory fraction of each, plus a personal veto over the tanks that ensured neither theory was ever truly tested. The strongpoints at Omaha were the forward wall of a defense whose depth had been argued away in a conference room months earlier. When the wall was breached, there was nothing behind it, and no one coming in time to restore it. The men who built the Atlantic Wall were not fools, and their work was not wasted in the way a badly designed fortification is wasted. Rommel's beach defenses were a genuinely formidable solution to the problem he believed he was solving. In a different battle, against a different enemy who obliged them by staying on the sand, those enfilade guns and that obstacle belt might well have produced the water's edge victory he wanted. The tragedy for the men in the nests was that the enemy who actually came did not play the game the fortress had been designed to win. The camouflaged casemate, the sideways gun, the pre-registered killing zone, all of it was a brilliant answer to a question the Americans simply refused to ask. And so we return to the soldier in Nest 62, above the Colleville draw, at the two ends of his single long day. At dawn, he sat behind a machine gun that could hardly miss, in a position sighted with real intelligence to sweep the beach with fire, shielded by concrete from the sea, backed by mortars and artillery that had measured every yard of the sand in front of him. By any reasonable measure, he held one of the strongest defensive positions on the whole invasion coast, and for an hour he and his comrades made the Americans pay a price that very nearly stopped the landing altogether. By afternoon he was low on ammunition, his observer dead, his flanking nests overrun, American infantry moving along the high ground behind him, and his fortress being taken apart from the one direction it had never been built to face. Nothing about his position had grown weaker over those hours. What had happened was that the battle had moved to the one place his design could not reach. The German theory of defending that beach was a theory about the waterline, about stopping the enemy in the water and on the sand where the guns could find him. The American way of taking that beach was a theory about the seam and the flank, about cracking the crust at its weakest points, and then leaving the killing zone entirely to unstitch the fortress from behind. Both were coherent ideas. Only one of them matched the ground, and the enemy actually present on the coast of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944. The Strongpoints could not hold in the end, not because they were weak, but because the men who built them had prepared, with enormous skill, for a battle that the men coming ashore had already decided not to fight. If this account gave you something to think about, the way a fortress can be both brilliant and doomed by the same design, then please hit the like button and subscribe. It is how detailed history like this reaches the people who care about understanding what actually happened, and not only the version everyone already knows.